I had always been drawn to places that isolated me from the rush of everyday life, so when I found a small cabin tucked deep in the forest for rent, it felt like fate. A week alone, surrounded by trees, disconnected from everything. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just nature, silence, and the endless canopy of trees. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable, with the bare essentials: a small kitchen, a wood stove, a worn but inviting bed, and a single narrow window that looked out over the forest, letting in beams of soft, filtered sunlight. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I settled into a slow routine, waking with the sunrise and spending my days exploring the surrounding woods. I didn't stray too far from the cabin, aware of how easy it could be to lose my way, but the solitude felt liberating. Each night I'd light a fire, read for a while by lantern light, and let the silence wrap around me like a blanket as I drifted to sleep. The isolation felt like a luxury. There were no sounds of passing cars or distant voices, just the occasional crackling of branches and the soft murmur of the wind rustling the leaves. It was so peaceful that I almost felt as though the forest were protecting me, drawing a line between me and the outside world. But the comfort of that silence, which had first felt so welcoming, began to weigh on me as night fell. Every noise, no matter how small, seemed amplified. I brushed it off, assuming I just needed time to adjust, to let my mind quiet down along with my surroundings. On the third night, I went to bed feeling more comfortable, confident that the cabin was becoming my sanctuary. I closed my eyes, expecting a deep, undisturbed sleep. But sometime around midnight, I was pulled from my slumber by a faint noise outside. I lay there in the dark, listening, as the faintest sound of footsteps drifted through the quiet. It wasn't the soft padding of an animal. The steps were slow, deliberate, as though someone or something were circling the cabin. I stayed frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination or maybe a large deer wandering by. But then the footsteps stopped, replaced by a rustling sound. It was close to the cabin, so close that I could feel the vibrations against the floorboards. My mind raced, searching for rational explanations, but nothing settled my unease. I lay awake, ears straining for any indication of where the sounds had come from, until finally they faded into silence. I was exhausted but alert, unable to shake the feeling that I was not alone out here. Eventually, I drifted back into an uneasy sleep, determined to check the area in the morning, hoping for some proof of a harmless explanation. The morning light brought a sense of relief, but the memory of the night lingered, making every step outside feel tense. I walked to the small well near the cabin to draw water, the early rays filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. As I leaned over to pull up the bucket, something caught my eye: footprints, fresh and damp in the soil around the well. I crouched down to get a better look, my heart sinking as I studied the prints. They were larger than mine, but something about the spacing struck me as odd, as though whatever had made them didn't walk in a natural way. I could almost picture the strange, lurching gait that must have produced them, and the image unsettled me. I tried to brush it off, reasoning that maybe a hiker had passed by, though I knew that was unlikely. People didn't just wander out here, not this deep in the forest. And besides, what kind of person would be roaming around my cabin in the dead of night? I stood there for a long time, staring at the footprints, feeling an odd sense of violation, as if my solitude had been broken by an unwelcome intruder. But I told myself it was nothing and returned to the cabin, hoping the day would drive away my lingering unease. When night fell, I tried to ignore the growing tension in my chest, telling myself that the previous night had been a one-off, just a passing animal. I settled into bed, attempting to relax, though sleep felt far away. But just when I thought I might finally doze off, a scratching sound jolted me awake. This wasn't footsteps or rustling. It was a slow, deliberate drag against the wooden walls of the cabin, almost as though long nails were scraping down the boards. The sound was low but incessant, accompanied by a faint, almost human moan, a low, guttural noise that made my skin crawl. I lay still, every instinct urging me not to move, as though whatever was out there might sense me if I shifted even slightly. The scraping moved around the cabin, dragging along each wall with a rhythmic persistence, circling me, taunting me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the noise, willing it to be a bad dream. But the sounds were all too real, grounding me in a terror that left me motionless and helpless. After what felt like hours, the sounds finally stopped, leaving me in a silence that felt thick, suffocating. I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for dawn with a desperate need to see the light again. The sun felt like my only refuge, and as its first rays crept through the window, I knew I had to check the walls, to confront whatever had been stalking me in the night. As soon as the morning light brightened the cabin, I ventured outside, still shaken from the night's events. The air was thick with an eerie quiet, as though the forest itself was watching. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the wooden walls. The sight of the marks nearly made me stagger back. Thin, jagged scratches ran down the walls, in erratic lines that seemed deliberate, almost like symbols or crude patterns scraped into the wood. The markings weren't random, and they weren't like anything an animal might make. They followed a disconcerting rhythm, as though they had been left as a message, a signal that something had been there and wasn't planning on leaving. The sight left me cold, a stark reminder of whatever was lurking outside in the dark. I checked the ground for any signs of movement, but there was nothing unusual, no further footprints to follow, only the strange, unsettling scratches marking the walls. I felt an oppressive weight in the air, a lingering presence that seemed to taunt me with silence. I went back inside, locking the door firmly behind me, though I knew that thin walls and a flimsy lock offered little protection. The day felt interminably long, a waiting game for nightfall. All I could do was hope that whatever had scratched the walls would lose interest and leave me alone. After that night, an odd calm settled over the cabin. Days went by without a sound. The forest returned to its usual rhythm, birds calling, leaves rustling, and the once familiar silence now felt empty but less menacing. I told myself it was over, that maybe whatever had been lurking had finally moved on, leaving me to the quiet solitude I'd initially come here for. But even as I tried to convince myself, a part of me remained on edge, cautious with each step I took outside. The cabin's charm had faded, replaced by a cold, stifling atmosphere. Yet I forced myself to ignore the nagging thoughts, to focus on my routine. I went to the well, walked along the familiar trails, and returned to the cabin each evening without incident. By the fourth day of silence, I almost started to believe it. I felt my body finally start to relax, my mind unclenching from its constant state of high alert. The forest seemed to breathe again, and I started to think of the scratches and sounds as an anomaly, a strange but isolated incident that had passed. But the peace was deceptive, a thin veneer over something far darker waiting beneath the surface, lurking just out of sight. Just as I began to feel comfortable again, it happened. I was lying in bed, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, when a loud knock jolted me from the haze of near sleep. The sound was deafening in the silent cabin, a violent pounding against the door that made the walls shudder. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, every nerve on high alert. The knocking wasn't tentative, it was deliberate, each knock heavy and intentional, as though something with undeniable strength was just outside, testing the door, seeing if it would hold. I lay there, paralyzed, feeling the cabin vibrate with each blow. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, the sound reverberating through me like a warning, a command. The knocking stopped, replaced by a scraping noise again, circling the walls, as if something were clawing at every inch, seeking a way in. The low moan returned, closer this time, an anguished, guttural sound that made my skin prickle with dread. Whatever was outside wanted me to know it was there, as though it were taunting me with its presence, knowing I was trapped and helpless within the walls. I lay there, eyes fixed on the door, as though the sheer force of my gaze could keep it closed. The sounds continued into the early hours of the morning, each one driving a fresh spike of terror through me, until at last, silence returned. I didn't dare close my eyes, didn't dare sleep, afraid that the sounds would resume the moment I let my guard down. When dawn broke, I knew I couldn't stay another moment. The previous night had erased any hope that whatever was out there would leave me in peace. I packed up quickly, hands shaking as I gathered my things, throwing everything into a bag without care. I was done with this place, done with the solitude and the quiet that had once felt comforting, but had turned into a trap. Living alone on my farm was a choice I'd made long ago, trading in the bustle of city life for the quiet solitude of the countryside. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I liked it that way. My days were spent in silence, my only companions the animals I tended to and the quiet rhythm of the land. The isolation wasn't lonely, it was liberating. I spent my days working from sunrise to sunset, the acres of land around me a sanctuary from the noise of the world. The farmhouse itself was modest, weathered by years of storms and seasons. It had its quirks, creaking floorboards and the occasional draft that slipped through the old windows, but it felt sturdy, like it belonged to the land as much as I did. And beyond the house, the forest stretched endlessly, a dense wall of trees that felt as much a part of my home as the fields and crops. There was something about living here that felt eternal, like the world had shrunk down to just me, the land and the seasons. The forest was my border, a natural wall that kept the outside world at bay. As the sun would dip below the horizon each evening, I'd feel a subtle shift in the air, a reminder of just how far removed I was from anything else. The silence that settled over the farm each night was as comforting as it was unsettling, a reminder that I was truly alone out here. Despite my comfort with the solitude, there was always a quiet unease that stirred as night fell. Some primal instinct would kick in, reminding me of the vulnerability that came with isolation. But each morning would come, and the world felt right again, the farm vibrant under the daylight. The peace here was unmatched, but that peace was about to turn, giving way to something I'd never anticipated. One night, as I lay in bed drifting into sleep, a noise caught my attention. A faint rustling outside, barely audible but unmistakable in the dead silence. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to a wandering animal or the wind stirring the dry leaves. The farmhouse often creaked and groaned as it settled into the night, so I figured it was just another sound blending into the background. But then I heard it again, a soft, persistent rustling that seemed to circle the house. It wasn't the quick movements of a small animal or the wind brushing against the walls. It was something heavier, more deliberate. The sound would pause, then pick up again, as though something or someone was walking along the perimeter, pacing with an unsettling patience. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears, trying to place the sound. My mind ran through rational explanations, a deer, maybe, or a stray dog, but something about it felt off. My pulse quickened, and I found myself wide awake, alert in a way I hadn't been since moving out here. I wanted to look out the window, to reassure myself that it was nothing, but some instinct held me back, warning me to stay out of sight. Eventually, the sounds faded, and silence reclaimed the night. I stayed awake for a long time after that, listening to every creak and groan of the house, waiting for the noise to return. But it didn't. As dawn finally crept over the horizon, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, hoping it had just been a one-off encounter, an animal passing through in the night. When morning came, I set out to check around the property, hoping to find some trace of whatever had been outside. As I walked through the soft earth around the farmhouse, something caught my eye. Footprints, clearly defined in the mud. They were larger than my own boots, with a shape that didn't quite look right, as though they were made by something heavy but unsure in its footing. The prints followed a strange path, circling the farmhouse and then trailing off toward the edge of the forest, where they seemed to disappear into the underbrush. I stood there, staring at the prints, feeling an unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The tracks were too deliberate, too close to the house to be from a random passerby or animal. The feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me from outside returned, sharper and more defined. I thought about calling someone, maybe a neighbor or the sheriff, but the rational part of me argued against it. After all, who would believe that a few footprints were cause for concern? I told myself that it was nothing, just an anomaly, a fluke that would pass. But as I walked back to the farmhouse, the unease clung to me like a shadow, following me through the daylight as I tried to go about my usual tasks. For the next few nights, things were quiet, and I began to let my guard down. The noises had stopped, and the memory of those footprints started to fade, sinking into the background of my mind. I returned to my routine, the rhythms of the farm, and the solitude settling around me once more. But then, on a quiet evening as the sun dipped low, I caught sight of something that sent a chill through me. At the edge of the property, near where the forest began, I noticed a shadow, tall, still, and distinctly human in shape. I stared, heart pounding as I tried to make out any details, but the figure stood just beyond the reach of the fading light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, but every instinct screamed that it was real, that something was standing there, just beyond my reach. Minutes ticked by, and I stayed rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the figure. Then, as if realizing it had been seen, the shadow slowly withdrew, melting back into the trees without a sound. I felt a strange mixture of fear and anger, a violation of the privacy I had sought out here. Someone had been there, watching from the forest, a presence that felt both foreign and deeply unsettling. I stood there long after the figure had vanished, staring into the darkness of the trees, wondering what or who I'd seen. My mind raced with questions, but one thing was certain. Whatever this was, it was no passing animal or illusion. Something was out there, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. Determined to find answers, I decided to check the edge of the forest the next morning, where the figure had appeared. As I reached the tree line, something caught my attention. A strange arrangement of stones on the ground. They formed an unusual pattern, a symbol that looked almost ritualistic. The stones were meticulously placed, each one purposefully arranged to form an odd, unsettling shape that I couldn't quite identify. I felt a wave of anger and unease as I stared down at the symbol. This wasn't just someone trespassing. This was something deliberate, something meant to be seen. I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't like it. In a moment of defiance, I kicked the stones apart, scattering them until the symbol was no longer recognizable. A strange heaviness lingered in the air as I walked back to the farmhouse, as though the forest itself was displeased. But I forced myself to brush it off, convinced that dismantling the symbol would put an end to the disturbances. I returned to the house, feeling a small sense of triumph, as if I'd reclaimed my space. But deep down, a nagging doubt lingered, whispering that I'd only made things worse. That night, the quiet I'd hoped for was shattered. As soon as darkness fell, the noises returned with a relentless intensity. Footsteps pacing back and forth just outside the walls, louder and heavier than before. They were closer now, circling the farmhouse with a maddening rhythm that seemed to echo inside my head. Then I heard a new sound, a dragging noise like something scraping against the walls, followed by the distinct sound of someone testing the door, jiggling the handle. My heart pounded as the realization set in that whatever was outside wasn't just here to disturb me. It was trying to get inside. I scrambled to barricade the door, dragging a heavy cabinet and shoving it against the entrance. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stacked furniture against every door and window, fortifying the farmhouse as best as I could. The noises continued, relentless, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, malicious, as though something was furious that I dared to disturb it. The night felt endless, each sound amplifying my terror, each moment stretching painfully as I sat there, wide awake, gripping a flashlight and waiting for dawn. Every creak, every tap against the walls seemed like a promise of something breaking through, a malevolent presence pressing against my makeshift defenses. The noises only ceased as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, bringing an abrupt, blessed silence. As the sun climbed higher, I forced myself to venture outside, hoping the nightmare had ended. But when I stepped out, a chill ran down my spine. Directly in front of the farmhouse, laid out with an unsettling precision, was the exact same stone symbol I'd destroyed the day before. Each stone was perfectly placed, forming the same eerie shape as before, as if to mock my defiance. I stood there, paralyzed, the realization sinking in that whatever was haunting me was not only undeterred by my actions, but was somehow fueled by them. The sight of the symbol felt like a warning, a clear message that this presence was not leaving, that it had marked this place and me for something I couldn't understand. In a mixture of fear and anger, I kicked the stones apart again, scattering them even farther this time, as if that could somehow break whatever hold this thing had on my farm. I turned my back on the forest, feeling its eyes on me as I returned to the farmhouse, desperately hoping that this act of defiance would be enough. And apparently it was, but I never heard the sounds or saw the figure again. The night was quiet, with a comforting stillness that wrapped around me as I walked. I just left a friend's party, the sounds of laughter and music fading into the distance behind me. The city felt calm, almost tranquil in the late hour, the streets deserted except for the occasional streetlight casting pools of yellow on the pavement. It was that time of night where the world felt paused, a kind of peaceful emptiness that I'd always enjoyed. My footsteps echoed in the silence, steady and familiar, grounding me as I turned down a side street. I felt the cool breeze brush against my skin, refreshing after the crowded warmth of the party. But as I walked further into the quiet, a faint sense of unease began to creep in, something I couldn't quite place. The stillness, once comforting, now felt slightly oppressive, as though the silence was holding its breath. Then I noticed it, a figure behind me, shadowed but unmistakably there. I told myself it was nothing, probably just someone heading home like I was. People lived all over this area. It wasn't unusual to see someone out late. Still, the thought lingered, a small seed of doubt that grew with each step I took. I kept walking, trying to shake off the discomfort, but the silence seemed to stretch, thickening around me. The figure kept pace, just far enough behind to seem innocuous, but close enough that I couldn't ignore the steady rhythm of his steps. I quickened my pace slightly, telling myself it was just coincidence, that I was letting the quiet get to me. But as I moved forward, the feeling of being watched settled over me, an unease that refused to be brushed aside. A few blocks later, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder again, hoping to confirm that the man was just going his own way. But there he was, still trailing behind, his face hidden in shadow, his movements deliberate. I turned back around, forcing myself to keep walking, but my heart began to pound in my chest. The empty streets, once serene, now felt like a trap, each step I took echoing too loudly in the oppressive silence. I turned down a quieter street, hoping that maybe he'd just continue straight and go his own way. But when I dared to glance back, he was still there, a few steps closer now, his pace quickening to match mine. I could feel his presence like a weight, pressing down on me with each second. My mind raced through options, trying to decide if I should confront him or keep moving, hoping that this was still some strange coincidence. I tried to calm myself, telling myself he was probably just another person heading home, someone who happened to be taking the same route. But the rationalizations began to crumble as I felt his gaze fixed on me, a dark presence in the corner of my vision. The quiet street felt more like a tunnel, closing in, each step echoing louder as the distance between us shrank. I swallowed hard, my mind screaming at me to do something, to make a move before it was too late. Just as I was starting to panic, debating whether to run, a second figure stepped out of an alleyway ahead, cutting off my path. He moved with purpose, his eyes locking onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The man behind me quickened his pace, and in an instant, I knew this wasn't just paranoia, this was deliberate. The second man advanced, reaching out as though to grab me, his expression predatory and unyielding. Instinct kicked in before I could think, and I twisted out of his reach, adrenaline flooding my veins as I broke into a sprint. I could hear their footsteps pounding behind me, the harsh sound of their breath mixing with mine as they chased me through the darkened streets. Panic surged through me, my mind racing as I darted between parked cars and down narrow alleys, desperate to lose them. The city, once peaceful and familiar, had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and threats. I could feel their presence close behind, relentless and unyielding, each footstep driving me forward, a heartbeat of fear pushing me to keep running. There was no time to think, only to escape, to put as much distance between me and them as possible. The chase became a blur of twisting corners and blind turns, my surroundings merging into a dark maze as I ran. Every breath was a struggle, my chest heaving as I pushed my body to its limits, driven by a terror that erased everything else. The men's footsteps were still close, their relentless pursuit pressing in on me, keeping my fear razor sharp. I darted through backyards, leaping over low fences, my shoes pounding against the pavement and gravel, the only sound in the silent night besides the harsh breathing behind me. Shadows seemed to stretch and reach for me, obstacles in the darkness both hiding me and making my escape treacherous. I glanced back only once, catching a glimpse of them still following, their figures looming in the half-light, their determination chilling. The city's silence turned oppressive, every quiet street amplifying the noise of the chase, each step echoing louder as though the city itself were trapping me. Desperation gnawed at me as I searched for a way out, a place to hide, somewhere that would offer even a momentary sanctuary. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, but I pushed on, knowing that slowing down was not an option. Then, up ahead, I spotted a hall, its door slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the night. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I veered toward it, slipping through the door and pressing myself into the darkness inside, hoping the shadows would cloak me from their view. I held my breath, heart pounding as I listened, praying they hadn't seen me slip inside. Inside the hall, I found myself engulfed in darkness, the only light coming from a faint sliver through a high, narrow window. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, amplifying the pounding of my heart. I pressed myself against a wall, breathing as quietly as I could, straining to hear any sounds from outside. The faint hum of the city beyond felt distant, irrelevant, as I waited, hoping my pursuers hadn't seen me enter. Footsteps echoed outside, coming closer. I could hear low voices murmuring just beyond the door, tense and searching. My heart froze as I listened, feeling every muscle tighten, every nerve on edge. The door creaked open, and a slant of dim light cut across the floor as one of the men stepped inside, his silhouette looming in the entryway. I held my breath, pressing myself further into the shadows, my mind racing with dread. The man's footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing in the silence as he scanned the dark hall. I stayed perfectly still, praying that he wouldn't notice me, that he'd turn around and leave, but he seemed to linger, his gaze sweeping over the room, sensing that I might be hiding somewhere nearby. The minutes stretched, my mind caught in a taut string of panic and desperation. Finally, he stepped back, muttering something to his companion as he left. The door swung shut, and their voices faded, leaving me in silence once more. Relief washed over me, though I knew it was only temporary. I needed to get out, to put as much distance between myself and them as possible. But I waited, staying hidden until I was sure they'd moved far enough away. Time seemed to slow as I stood in the darkness, listening to the faint sounds from outside. The silence in the hall felt oppressive, pressing in on me, amplifying every creak and shuffle. I could still hear the men outside, their voices muted but tense, as though they were deciding whether to continue their search. Each second felt like an eternity, stretching my nerves to the breaking point. I focused on my breathing, trying to keep it steady, though every instinct screamed at me to move, to escape. But I knew that any noise, any small movement, could give me away, could alert them to my presence. I forced myself to stay still, to wait until the voices outside grew softer, more distant, indicating that they were finally losing interest. Minutes passed, then more, each one dragging out as I waited for the right moment. At last, I heard one of them mutter something to the other, their voices growing fainter as they moved further from the hall. The relief was almost overwhelming, but I remained cautious, giving them more time to move on before I dared to make a move. When I was certain they were gone, I took a deep breath and moved toward the side exit, praying it would lead me somewhere safe, somewhere out of their reach. The handle turned smoothly, and I slipped through the door, out into the night. My senses sharp, my body ready to run if I spotted them nearby. The street outside was dark, deserted, the silence heavy and unnerving. I moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows, glancing over my shoulder with every step. The fear that they might reappear kept my pulse racing, urging me to put as much distance between myself and the hall as possible. I slipped down side streets, cutting through alleys and weaving through darkened neighborhoods. My mind focused only on escape, my surroundings a blur as I pushed myself to keep moving, to stay ahead of any chance they might still be pursuing me. I avoided the main roads, keeping to the quieter, less lit areas, hoping that the cover of darkness would shield me from any prying eyes. The silence weighed on me, an empty void that felt both protective and menacing. I didn't dare stop, not until the faint sounds of the city returned, signaling that I was finally nearing safer, more familiar ground. After what felt like hours, I finally slowed, my body exhausted from the chase. The street ahead was lit, lined with small shops and late-night cafes, the kind of place where people might still be awake, where the safety of other voices and lights would finally break the tension that had haunted me through the night. I glanced behind me one last time, heart still pounding, but the shadows were empty, the silence unbroken. It started with little things, things I barely noticed at first. A patch of flattened grass near the front steps, footprints leading up to my driveway, faint impressions I thought were from animals or maybe the neighborhood kids cutting through my yard. At first, I didn't think much of it. Living alone had made me accustomed to hearing odd sounds or seeing the occasional mess left behind by passing animals. But then more signs began to appear. I'd find things slightly out of place in the mornings, a garden tool left in the open, small objects shifted just enough to be noticeable. At night, I'd catch myself glancing out the window, wondering if something or someone was out there. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of my own mind, a small paranoia brought on by the quiet. Yet the sense of being watched started to grow. Every time I stepped outside, I felt an inexplicable sense of unease, as if unseen eyes followed my every move. I brushed it off, trying to ignore it, but the feeling persisted. A shadow at the corner of my vision would sometimes flicker, only to disappear when I turned to look. I told myself it was nothing, that my imagination was running wild, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the thought that someone was watching. The days went by, and with each one, the signs became harder to ignore. Every evening, I'd notice something new, like cigarette butts near the side fence, smudged against the dirt as though someone had been standing there, watching. Then there were scratches on the side gate, faint but fresh, as though someone had tried to get in, or maybe tested the gate for weakness. My anxiety began to mount, and I found myself double-checking my locks and securing the windows before bed. I even took to keeping a small flashlight by my bedside, just in case. Then, one evening, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, I heard it. Faint footsteps outside, so soft that they seemed to melt into the background, but unmistakable. My heart leapt, and I moved to the window, straining to see anything beyond the shadows. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just the empty yard, silent and unmoving, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. The footsteps ceased, but the memory of them lingered, replaying in my mind. I tried to tell myself it had been nothing, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The thought that someone might be out there, lurking just beyond my reach, kept me on edge. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. With each passing day, my sleep grew more fragmented, filled with the paranoia of eyes watching me through the dark. My usual bedtime rituals felt inadequate. I'd leave lights on in the kitchen and hallway, hoping to deter anyone who might be watching. I stayed up later, pacing, checking the windows for any sign of movement outside. It felt like my own home was turning into a place of unrest, haunted not by ghosts but by a very real human presence that I couldn't see. One night, I was jolted awake by a soft, rhythmic tapping against the window. My heart pounded as I sat up, clutching the blanket and straining to see into the darkness outside. The tapping continued, a faint, persistent sound that sent a chill down my spine. I forced myself to get out of bed, moving cautiously toward the window, expecting to see a face staring back at me. But when I looked, there was nothing, just the yard, bathed in the pale glow of the moon, still and empty. I returned to bed, but sleep was out of reach. I lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to every creak and sigh of the house, every faint rustle of wind outside. The silence pressed in around me, and though I couldn't see anyone, the sense of someone watching from the shadows was as tangible as a presence in the room. By the time dawn arrived, I was exhausted, drained by the feeling that I was no longer alone. The days that followed only heightened my unease. The signs became more alarming, each one a reminder that whoever was out there wasn't going away. One morning, I found items in my home slightly out of place, things I knew I hadn't moved. A book that had been on the coffee table was now on the floor, a small knick-knack from the shelf turned at an odd angle. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to set my nerves on edge. Had someone actually been inside? There were more signs outside, too. Scratches on the door as though someone had tried to force it open. Faint scuff marks on the porch as if someone had been pacing, waiting for something. An unfamiliar scent lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable, something sharp and smoky, as though the stranger had left a part of himself behind. The realization that he might have come so close, maybe even inside my home, left me reeling, a gnawing fear sinking deep. Every night, I found myself unable to shake the sense of impending danger. The feeling that someone was watching, waiting, had settled over me like a fog, inescapable and suffocating. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that I was safe inside, but the evidence of the stranger's presence was all around me, impossible to ignore. I began to wonder if confronting him was inevitable, a looming threat that no lock or light could keep away. On the night of the full moon, I found myself outside, trying to ease the tension that had been building inside me for days. The silver light bathed my yard in an eerie glow, every shadow sharpened, every detail illuminated. I took a deep breath, hoping the sight of the open sky and the moon would calm my nerves. The night was silent, a stillness that felt both soothing and foreboding. I moved further into the yard, letting my eyes adjust to the soft light, almost convincing myself that everything was normal. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I felt it, a cold grip on my arm, sudden and tight. My heart seized, and I barely had time to register the shock before a figure emerged from behind the plants, his face shadowed and unreadable. The stranger, the one who had been lurking, was finally right in front of me, his grip unrelenting. I tried to pull free, but his hand held firm, an iron grip that sent a surge of panic through me. The calm of the moonlit night vanished, replaced by a raw, instinctual fear that made every muscle tense, every sense sharpen. My mind raced, searching for a way out, for anything I could use to break free from his grasp. Without thinking, I reached for the closest object, a heavy flower pot sitting on the nearby ledge. With all the strength I could muster, I swung it at him, the pot connecting with a sickening thud against his head. The impact jolted through me, a brutal shock that left him momentarily stunned. His grip loosened, and I seized the chance, wrenching my arm free and stumbling backward. I didn't look back as I dashed toward the house, my only thought to get inside, to lock the doors and walls between us. Every step felt like a race against time, as though he could grab me again at any moment. My heart hammered as I flung open the door, stumbling inside and slamming it shut behind me. I twisted the lock, bracing against the door as though my weight alone could keep him out. My hands shook, the adrenaline still coursing through me, but I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed more furniture, shoving it against the door and barricading every possible entry. My mind was a blur of fear and urgency, each movement fueled by the lingering memory of his grip, the dark shadow that had waited so patiently to strike. Once I'd secured every door and window, I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my fingers trembling as I waited for someone to answer. My voice was shaky, but I managed to explain what had happened, urging them to come quickly. The operator's calm tone was a strange contrast to the chaos inside me, but I clung to it, hoping their arrival would end this nightmare. Minutes passed, each one dragging out painfully as I listened, every small creak and whisper amplified in the silence. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the shadowy figure staring back at me. The house, once a refuge, now felt fragile, its walls too thin to keep out the terror that lingered just beyond. I paced, every nerve on edge, waiting for the sound of sirens, for anything that would break the suffocating quiet. Outside, the yard lay still under the moon's watchful glow, an unsettling calm that seemed to mock my fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, hidden in the shadows, watching and waiting. When the police finally arrived, their flashing lights cut through the night, a beacon of reassurance that made the dread inside me ebb, if only slightly. I let them in, explaining the night's events, my words a jumbled rush as I recounted the stranger's appearance, the struggle, and the feeling that I'd been watched for days. They listened, their faces unreadable, as they began to search the yard, shining their flashlights into every corner, every shadow. But as the minutes ticked by, the search turned up nothing. No figure lurking in the bushes, no sign of forced entry, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there at all. They found no footprints, no evidence of the struggle, not even the flower pot I'd used to fend him off. The yard was eerily untouched, as though the events of the night had never happened. The officers reassured me that they'd patrol the area, that they'd keep an eye out, but their words felt hollow, the reality of the situation slipping through my fingers like sand. As they left, a cold realization settled over me. Whatever had been out there, whatever had haunted my yard and lurked in the shadows, had vanished without a trace, leaving only questions in its wake. It was an ordinary weekday afternoon when the doorbell rang, catching me off guard. I wasn't expecting anyone, but there, on the doorstep, stood a man dressed in a neatly pressed uniform with an official-looking badge clipped to his jacket. He introduced himself as a public service worker, explaining he was conducting routine checks in the area. His tone was professional, calm, and his demeanor seemed reassuring. He began asking questions, mostly harmless ones about the house, the neighborhood, and my general satisfaction with local services. I answered, feeling a bit puzzled, but assuming it was part of a standard survey, or perhaps an inspection of some kind. His questions seemed thorough, if a little personal, but I brushed it off as part of the protocol. As he wrapped up, he thanked me, his friendly smile lingering a moment longer than expected before he turned and walked away. I watched him go, feeling vaguely unsettled, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The encounter seemed harmless enough, yet something about it stuck with me, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. A few days passed, and I'd almost forgotten about the visit when the man returned, again unannounced. This time his questions took a slightly different tone, focusing more on my routines. He asked about the times I was usually home, whether I worked late, if I had family or friends nearby. I felt a twinge of discomfort, but he maintained his polite, professional demeanor, and I kept telling myself that this must be part of the process. Yet, something felt off. His eye contact was intense, his gaze lingering as he listened to my answers with a kind of focused interest that didn't seem to match the questions. He didn't take notes, and his questions seemed to flow without any specific structure, veering more personal with each passing minute. When he left, I closed the door with a strange sense of relief. There was a nagging voice in the back of my mind, urging me to be cautious, but I pushed it down, reasoning that I was likely overreacting. Still, the encounter left me with a lingering discomfort, as though a shadow had fallen over the familiarity of my home. Several days later, he was back again, showing up without warning. His questions were even more direct, probing into details I found difficult to justify as relevant to any public service inspection. He asked about my family members, specific routines, and even commented on a recent delivery I'd had, a package he somehow knew about, though I hadn't mentioned it. The shift in his behavior was subtle but unmistakable. His friendly smile seemed forced, his tone less courteous and more insistent. He asked about my security system, my daily movements, and even whether I had plans to leave town soon. The questions were masked as casual, but they felt invasive, as though he were trying to gather more than just information. A sense of dread settled in as I gave short, evasive answers, each word chosen carefully. Something was undeniably wrong, but I couldn't understand why he would be asking these questions if he truly were a public servant. When he left, I locked the door and double-checked the windows, a wave of anxiety rippling through me. The questions, his demeanor, all of it felt wrong. Over the next few days, my unease grew, and I found myself replaying the conversations in my mind, each detail standing out more clearly. I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that something was deeply wrong. The way he'd appeared each time without warning, the strange questions, the probing into my personal life, It all pointed to something far from normal. I decided to do some research, hoping to find some clarification about routine public service visits. I checked local guidelines and found nothing to suggest such visits were common or that they involved such probing questions. My doubt turned to suspicion as I realized that no one else in the area had received a similar visit. Feeling increasingly anxious, I debated whether to contact someone for advice. Each visit had left me feeling more exposed, more vulnerable, and I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that he was not who he claimed to be. I resolved to be cautious, deciding that if he returned, I wouldn't answer his questions so freely. The lingering sense of dread told me to trust my instincts, and I prepared myself to confront him if necessary. Another knock came a few days later, catching me off guard again. The man stood on my doorstep, his expression more intense than before, and his questions came quickly, as if he were eager to get specific answers. He didn't bother with pleasantries this time, immediately diving into personal questions that felt less like inquiries and more like demands. His eyes narrowed when I hesitated, his tone shifting into something almost threatening. He asked about my security measures, whether I had cameras or alarms, and pressed me on my routine, asking when I was typically away from home. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a cold realization dawning on me. This man was no public servant, and his interest in my life was far from professional. Forcing a polite but firm tone, I cut the conversation short, refusing to answer his questions and suggesting he contact the appropriate authorities if he had further inquiries. His eyes darkened, and for a moment, he just stood there, his gaze lingering on me as though assessing me. Without a word, he turned and left, his steps heavy and slow as he walked away, a palpable tension hanging in the air. As I closed the door, my heart raced, my hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. This was no misunderstanding. Something was very wrong, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to take action, and I couldn't risk waiting for him to show up again. After the unsettling encounter, I immediately contacted the police, explaining the situation and my growing suspicion that this man was not who he claimed to be. My voice shook as I recounted the details of his visits, his increasingly invasive questions, and the strange intensity in his demeanor. The officer on the other end listened carefully, assuring me that they took these matters seriously and would look into it. They promised to investigate the man's identity, mentioning that cases of impersonation had been reported before, though rarely with such persistence. The officer's calm, steady voice brought a sense of relief, though a residual tension remained. I'd done everything I could, but the waiting was agonizing. I spent the evening checking every lock, every window, every possible entry point, bracing myself for the possibility that he might come back. Sleep didn't come easily that night, every noise outside amplified by my heightened sense of caution. The once comforting silence of my home now felt oppressive, each shadow a reminder of the man's lingering presence. I knew I'd done the right thing by contacting the police, but the fear lingered, gnawing at me, making every moment feel like a countdown. A few days later, the police contacted me with the results of their investigation. The officer informed me that the man had no connection to any public service agency. He was, in fact, a known criminal with a record of impersonating officials to gather personal information, often targeting isolated individuals. They confirmed that his actions were likely part of a broader scheme, one that had put others at risk in the past. Hearing the truth left me stunned, a strange mixture of relief and dread settling over me. On one hand, I was grateful that my instincts had been right, that I'd trusted my gut enough to reach out to the authorities. But the reality of it, knowing that I'd allowed this man into my life, into the privacy of my home, even for those brief encounters, left me feeling exposed and violated. The officer assured me that they were taking the matter seriously and that he wouldn't be returning. Still, a part of me felt haunted by the thought of his visits, by the way he'd looked at me, as though studying every detail of my life. I thanked the police, feeling a rush of gratitude for their help, but still shaken by how close I'd come to something far more dangerous. It started quietly, almost unnoticeable. A car, idling just outside my home, its headlights off, but its silhouette visible in the dim light from the street lamp. It was parked slightly to the side, as if avoiding direct notice. I remember thinking nothing of it at first, just a car on the curb, nothing unusual. But as the days passed, the image of that car started embedding itself into my awareness. The first time I saw it, I convinced myself it was merely a neighbor's friend, someone waiting or lost. I paid it no mind, kept walking to my door, keys in hand, and settled in for the night without a second thought. The next morning, when I stepped outside, there it was again. The same car, parked in the same spot, a lone figure sitting rigidly behind the wheel. When I came home that night, the car was there once more, the figure's gaze unmistakably directed at my front door. I paused, almost long enough to stare back, but unease edged my every step, pushing me inside. I told myself it was all a coincidence, a harmless repetition. But from that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that my house had become the focal point of someone's quiet, unsettling attention. Days turned into a week, and every evening, the car was waiting. It had become a constant, an unwanted fixture just outside my home, as if a stranger's shadow had draped itself across my threshold. I began looking out the window at odd hours, scanning the street to see if the car was there. Each time, without fail, it was, and each time, the figure inside seemed to have settled further into a pattern of observation. I'd grown reluctant to leave, calculating how long I'd be gone and wondering what might happen in my absence. It was no longer just a car on the street, but a silent threat, a persistent reminder that I was being watched. The person inside never left, never did anything but sit. They only observed, a passive presence, like a warning that hovered just out of reach. I watched them as they watched me, unsure of what they wanted or why they chose me. The unsettling stillness of it all, that relentless silence, felt like an intrusion, a hand pressed against the glass, waiting to see if I'd react. I didn't yet know how long this would last, but my mind began to tangle in knots, thinking of the figure outside, wondering what they saw when they looked at me. After the second week, the car's presence had grown into something insidious, lingering in the edges of my consciousness, shaping my every move. I started marking the time of its arrival and departure, noting that it came at dusk and left near dawn, like it had some set purpose in watching over the house in those darker hours. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Each time I approached my home, that car loomed in my vision, immovable and inescapable. I knew by now that this was no mere accident. Whoever sat behind that wheel was watching my home, tracking my movements with a patience that felt both calculated and disturbing. When I stepped out for groceries, they were there. When I went for a late-night walk, they remained, eyes tracking me from behind that unchanging glass. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? There was no crime in sitting in a parked car. I knew what I felt, that gnawing unease twisting inside me, yet I felt powerless to act against it. Each night, as I lay in bed, I felt their gaze piercing through the walls as if I'd brought their haunting into my very home. I started feeling trapped, cornered in my own home, like a small animal held under the intense gaze of a silent predator. The car and its occupant had worked their way under my skin, and every action now felt observed, analyzed. I shifted my routines, thinking that if I left at unpredictable times, I might shake them off, force them to reveal something. But it didn't matter how much I changed. The car was always there, its presence undisturbed by my attempts to escape it. Even inside my own walls, the security I once felt had faded. Each creak, each gust against the windows seemed amplified, filling the silence with ominous weight. My routines changed again. I stopped leaving at night, closed the curtains tightly, and took to moving quietly, convinced that my every step might betray me to whoever waited outside. I felt my nerves fraying, a thin thread stretched tight, ready to snap. Each night I lay awake, anticipating some next step, some escalation, but it never came. The presence remained static, constant, each night compounding the psychological toll. In the pit of my mind, a persistent thought whispered, they were waiting for something, and whatever it was, I would be there to bear witness. The next morning, I resolved to confront them. I couldn't continue living with this shadow cast across my life. I paced near the window, watching the car as if it were a feral creature that could bolt at any movement. Finally, with a steadying breath, I stepped outside, striding toward the street, hoping to break through the barrier of silence that had surrounded me for so long. But before I even reached the curb, the engine roared to life. The driver turned away, steering the car slowly down the street, disappearing before I had a chance to get close. I stood there in the empty street, a cold feeling settling in my chest. It was as if they had anticipated my move, as if they'd already calculated every possible step I might take. My frustration boiled into anger, but it was swallowed whole by a sense of defeat as I returned to my home, feeling as though I had been tested and found wanting. Inside, the walls felt closer, confining, with shadows creeping into every corner. Their evasion seemed almost mocking, a reminder that they held control of this twisted game. I had failed to break free of the silent grip they held on me, and my frustration only added to the suffocating fear that had wrapped itself around my life. My days turned into rituals of observation, watching them as intently as they watched me. I took photos of the car, documented every detail, the color, the license plate, the slight dents on the hood. I created a record of every appearance, every minute they spent watching, as if this could give me some sense of control over the situation. But the longer I observed, the more unhinged I felt. I'd stare out the window for hours, waiting for the familiar outline to appear, tracing each movement as though there were some hidden message in the way they parked or the exact moment they arrived. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sinking deeper into their trap, my obsession with tracking them feeding the very fear they had inspired. Days blurred, each one marked by the car's presence, until my home no longer felt like a refuge. Instead, it had become a cage, a prison where I was both inmate and warden, my every movement scrutinized by that silent figure outside. I was locked in a cycle of dread, both drawn to and repelled by the presence that had somehow claimed dominion over my life. One night, the tension reached a peak I hadn't anticipated. I had watched them arrive, had waited as they settled into their familiar post. But something inside me snapped. Without thinking, I stormed outside again, barely noticing the cool night air as I marched toward the car. This time, I felt certain that I would confront them, force them out of their silence, make them reveal whatever it was they wanted. But as before, the car pulled away with eerie precision, gliding down the street as though guided by some invisible hand. I chased it as far as I could, my footsteps echoing in the quiet night, but I quickly lost sight of it. Exhausted and defeated, I stood alone in the empty street, feeling the futility of my own efforts pressed down on me. It was as if they'd been waiting for me to break, feeding off my unraveling composure. Returning inside, I couldn't shake the sense that they'd achieved their goal, whatever that was. I felt hollow, stripped of any power I once thought I had. The car's absence felt more oppressive than its presence, and I realized that they had succeeded in invading the very core of my being. Even without the car in sight, I felt watched, haunted by the memory of that silent observer. And then one day, it was over. I glanced outside, as I had every morning, expecting to see the car. But the street was empty, devoid of any sign of my silent watcher. It started innocently enough. I was scrolling through my phone, lazily swiping through notifications and updates, when something caught my eye. A local news story that seemed unusually timely. The article headline mentioned a restaurant I'd just mentioned in passing to a friend. The odd thing was, I hadn't searched for it or typed it out. It was just something I'd brought up in conversation, barely worth noting. I dismissed it, chalking it up to some bizarre algorithmic coincidence, one of those strange quirks of modern technology. But over the next few days, I noticed more notifications appearing that felt similarly personal. Another story popped up about a particular hiking trail I'd been thinking about visiting, but hadn't mentioned to anyone or even searched online. I felt a twinge of discomfort but brushed it off, convincing myself it was just that, some strange but harmless coincidence. Then came an article that felt like a slap in the face. A headline on a self-improvement site discussed overcoming specific doubts and fears I had been grappling with privately, thoughts I hadn't even articulated out loud. It was too direct, almost like it had been crafted with my exact thoughts in mind. I ignored it, tried to push it out of my mind, but the feeling lingered. Something was paying attention to my every thought. With each passing day, the notifications grew more specific, and my patience with them wore thin. A few times a day, I'd get a pop-up about something I'd casually considered, or something that seemed to align a little too perfectly with my recent life choices. My phone buzzed with suggestions for local events and news stories that weren't just close to my location, but felt eerily close to me personally. It felt as if someone were shadowing my life, monitoring my internal dialogue. Every notification seemed to mirror my private world, each one a reminder that I was under some kind of observation. It was more than a technological annoyance. It was personal, an unsettling glimpse into my own life that no machine should have known. I started to question every app I'd downloaded, every permission I'd granted, every innocuous tap on allow that I'd made without a second thought. I felt an uncomfortable awareness seeping into every moment, a presence hiding behind each buzz and notification. I wanted to believe it was all just clever algorithms, but something about the constant intrusiveness was beginning to shake that idea. The notifications began to feel relentless, and each one set my nerves on edge. I'd grown to dread the familiar buzz of my phone, knowing that every alert might be yet another reminder that I was somehow being watched. Each message seemed to know something new about me, no matter how private or trivial. My mind started spinning, conjuring up scenarios about who might be behind it and why. Soon, I couldn't stop myself from checking my phone obsessively, as if each new notification might provide some insight into the source. I would swipe through each headline, reading it multiple times, searching for clues or messages hidden in the words. The updates were innocuous enough on the surface, yet they somehow resonated with thoughts and ideas I had never spoken aloud. The growing specificity felt like a game someone was playing, testing how closely they could follow my life without being detected. My attempts to ignore it proved futile. My thoughts felt invaded, laid bare before some unseen watcher. Everywhere I went, I could feel the weight of an invisible gaze pressing down on me. I was afraid to share this with anyone, as if speaking about it might make it worse. The more I tried to push it aside, the more entrenched the feeling became, wrapping itself around my mind with a quiet but unyielding grip. I couldn't take it anymore. I spent an entire evening scouring through every privacy setting I could find, disabling permissions, revoking access, and scrubbing my device of anything that felt remotely invasive. I cleared my search history, logged out of every account, and adjusted every setting that I thought might put a layer between me and whatever or whoever was tracking me. But it didn't matter. The next day, the notifications returned, as specific and unnerving as ever. Each one felt like an intentional breach, as if my device were taunting me with its knowledge. My attempts to secure my privacy seemed futile, each adjustment ignored or overwritten by some unseen force that insisted on following my every step. I felt helpless, at the mercy of something beyond my control. I considered getting a new phone, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Whatever was observing me had already embedded itself into the cracks of my life. Each time I looked at my phone, I felt its gaze reflecting back at me, a silent witness to thoughts I had never intended to share. It was no longer just a phone. It was a gateway, an instrument through which someone had pried open my life and settled into the spaces I had once thought were mine alone. The notifications became more than unsettling, they were invasive. Each one seemed to know exactly what I was doing, down to the smallest detail. I received updates about specific places I'd walked past, topics I'd briefly considered, even reminders that eerily mirrored my private anxieties and fears. They didn't just follow my actions, they echoed moments of introspection, mirroring thoughts I hadn't shared with anyone. It was as though my life had become an open book, dissected line by some unseen observer. I felt an overwhelming sense of exposure, as if the walls around me had grown transparent, turning my every private moment into something observed and cataloged. With each notification, my frustration grew, escalating into a full sense of panic. I found myself wondering if someone close to me was involved, or if this was some elaborate scheme I couldn't understand. The ordinary had taken on an air of menace, each familiar place and object twisted by the feeling that they were being used against me. Yet, every attempt to escape felt futile. My phone, once a harmless companion, had become a tool of intrusion, an unyielding reminder of my own helplessness. The notifications continued, each one a thorn in my thoughts, each buzz a silent confirmation that my life was no longer my own. In a moment of desperation, I turned off my phone completely, cutting off my only connection to the notifications that had haunted me for weeks. I felt an immediate sense of relief, as if I had finally managed to shut out the invasive presence that had wormed its way into my life. I even went as far as avoiding my laptop and any other device that might connect me back to that endless stream of surveillance. For the first time in weeks, my thoughts felt like they were truly mine. The silence that followed was profound, almost healing. But it wasn't long before the stillness turned into a different kind of anxiety. Without the notifications, my mind filled with questions. Was this all in my head, or had I managed to escape something real, something invasive? The quiet grew oppressive, each hour spent disconnected amplifying my paranoia, making me wonder if the silence was just another part of the game, a ploy to lure me back into the cycle. By the end of the third day, I couldn't take it any longer. The absence of my phone had become just as unsettling as its presence once was, and with a shaky resolve, I turned it back on. I held my breath, waiting for the first notification to appear, uncertain whether I'd find relief or further confirmation of the nightmare I'd created around myself. It didn't take long. Almost as soon as the screen lit up, a notification appeared, a single cryptic message that seemed to defy the usual format of news and updates. There was no headline, no accompanying article, just a brief, vague statement that felt both personal and threatening. "We know you've been waiting." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. There was no source, no application or website claiming responsibility for the message. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere, specifically tailored to taunt me in this exact moment. The message didn't clarify who "we" was or what they knew, but its existence was enough to unsettle me completely. I felt the creeping horror of confirmation, the realization that my fears had not been baseless. Someone, or something, had indeed been watching, following my every step, tracking my every thought. I scrolled through my phone, but there was nothing else, just that one message lingering on the screen. It was a reminder that no matter how many steps I took to protect myself, I would never truly be free from the shadow that had now become a part of my life. In a last-ditch attempt to reclaim my sanity, I shut off my phone for good, feeling the finality of it settle over me like a heavy weight. I packed it away, shoved it in the back of a drawer, and resolved never to turn it on again. My connection to the digital world had become a gateway to something I could no longer endure, and severing it felt like the only way to truly escape.